The first time Mason Crow saw Caleb Ramirez, it was from the edge of a vineyard row, backlit by a thin sunset and the gold dust of harvest dust in the air. Mason had been hired to help with loading and sorting, the kind of work that kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. He told himself that was all it was: physical labor, a paycheck, a temporary escape. But Caleb wasn't just another worker. Caleb moved like he belonged here, like the rows of vines was something he could read. Even from a distance, Mason noticed the way Caleb paused to check the crates counting without looking like he was counting, noticing the smallest bruises on fruit that other people would have overlooked. And when Caleb looked up, his eyes didn't scan the grounds the way most people did. They landed on Mason, not in a flirtatious way, more like a steady recognition, the kind that made Mason feel briefly seen, then immediately exposed. Mason tightened the grip of his gloves around his hands. He turned toward the sorting table, as if the work had suddenly become more urgent. He told himself he didn't have the energy for anything that could become a problem. For months now, he'd been living around the hole his last relationship left behind. His boyfriend, his ex had called it a necessary distance at first. Then it became silence. Then it became a life that moved forward without Mason in it. Mason had tried to be brave. He had tried to be the easy one. And when he finally realized he wasn't the easy one at all, he was just easy to forget. He'd retreated so deep into his own quiet that even joy felt like a stranger. So that vineyard job was supposed to be safe. It wasn't supposed to bring him somebody who watched the world with that kind of gentleness. The harvest night got colder, faster than Mason expected. The sky darkened in layers, and the work shifted from bright coordination to a more intimate rhythm: lanterns swinging, the soft thud of crates, the smell of crushed grapes and damp earth. Mason kept to his task. Caleb did too, but every so often Caleb's voice would cut through the noise, low and calm. "Here, let me check the bottoms," Caleb said the first time when Mason almost stacked crates too tight. Mason's throat tightened as he looked at him. "I know how to stack," he replied, the words sharper than he meant. Caleb's mouth curved slightly, not mocking. "I believe you. I'm just making sure the fruit doesn't get damaged." Mason stared at the crates as if the labels could explain why his pulse kept skipping. He didn't want to be the kind of man who reacted to kindness like it was danger. They worked shoulder to shoulder for a while. When Mason reached for a crate, Caleb reached for the same one from the opposite side. Their hands brushed barely, just fingertips touching, and the contact made Mason feel warm in a way. He wasn't sure it was from the lantern light. He yanked his hand back as if he'd been burned. Caleb didn't comment. He slid the crate gently onto the stack and nodded toward the aisle. "Your gloves are tangled. It's making you tug." Mason glanced down. He realized Caleb was right. His gloves were twisted in a way that had been irritating him all evening. That should have been the end of it. Practical help, nothing more. But Mason's mind turned it into something else. Somebody noticing him, somebody tracking his small discomforts, somebody caring enough to fix them. By the time they took their break, the vineyard sounded like a distant ocean. Crickets, wind, the faint hum of generators. Workers sat on overturned crates with paper cups of coffee they probably didn't like, but drank because it helped them pretend they were fine. Mason sat apart, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. He kept his gaze on the rows beyond the lanterns. The vines looked like dark ribbons pulled taut across the hill. Caleb sat down 2 crates away, not close enough to force conversation, close enough to make silence feel shared instead of lonely. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Mason listened to himself, breathed, and tried not to notice how Caleb's presence made his body feel steadier. Then Caleb said, "You don't talk much." Mason forced a laugh that didn't fully arrive. "Maybe I'm just tired." Caleb nodded slowly. "I get that. Harvest takes it out of everyone. But you keep your eyes on your hands, like you're waiting for something to go wrong. Mason's stomach tightened. Is that what you think? Caleb didn't defend himself. He let the question hang. Mason stared at the coffee cup. He didn't want to give this man any access. He didn't want to be the kind of wounded person Caleb would eventually pity. Mason had learned that pity was its own kind of abandonment. So he said, "I've just had a rough year." Caleb's attention sharpened in a way that didn't feel invasive. "Rough how?" Mason hesitated. He thought of the emails he'd sent after the last conversation ended. He thought of the way his ex had stopped answering, not with anger, but with a calm finality that made Mason feel like he had been erased. He forced his voice steady. It didn't end clean." Caleb leaned back slightly, like he was giving Mason space to decide how deep to go. That kind of ending sticks. It makes you think you did something wrong, even when you didn't. Mason swallowed. It was too close to the truth. He tried to deflect. "You say things like you've been through it." Caleb's eyes flicked toward the vines, then back. "I have. Just not the same thing. I broke my own trust once. Took me a long time to learn how to live with myself after." Mason felt a strange, involuntary calm at that. Not because Caleb's pain erased Mason's, but because Caleb didn't perform strength. He spoke like a man who had carried something heavy and learned where it belonged. Across the break area, Theo Bennett, another worker, laughed at something someone said. Theo had the kind of easy charm that made people gravitate toward him. He stood up, stretched his back, and walked closer to Mason and Caleb's little island. "You guys still alive?" Theo asked. Mason gave him a tired smile. "Barely," Theo grinned. "Wait until you see what the boss has in store for tomorrow. It's like we're training for a marathon we didn't sign up for." Caleb nodded. "Better to prepare." Theo looked at Mason like he was trying to decide whether to be nosy. "Hey, Mason, you staying on site tonight?" Mason frowned. He hadn't told anyone his plan. "Yeah, if there's a room left," Theo chuckled. "There's always a room left for the right person." Mason's instinct flared part annoyance, part caution. He'd learned that people who spoke like that sometimes meant, "I want something." Theo seemed to read the tension. He held up his hands. "Not like that. Just." Theo paused, then shrugged. "The cabin gets cold. And sometimes people get weird. Like they start talking too much when they're tired." Caleb's gaze tightened. "Theo?" Theo lifted his eyebrows. "What?" "I'm warning him." Mason stared between them. "Is there a problem I should know about?" Theo's smile faded a fraction. "No problem, just the cabin is close quarters. People bring their weather inside with them." Caleb looked at Mason again. Something about his expression made Mason feel like Caleb already understood what Theo meant, even if Mason couldn't yet. They returned to work. Mason tried to focus on the fruit counting, sorting, packing, but the conversation lodged in him. He kept imagining the cabin, the narrow hallway, the old heater, the smell of wood and sweat. He imagined himself lying awake, alone with his memories. The night shifted again, deeper and darker, and Mason realized his hands were slowing. Not from fatigue exactly, from emotion. His body was bracing. The harvest crew eventually finished around midnight. People started to peel away in clusters, some cheerful, some too quiet. Mason washed up in a small service area and felt the cold water on his wrists clear some of the fatigue from his skin. When he went to the cabin, the hallway lights flickered. The door creaked when he stepped inside, and he paused, listening. He could hear muffled voices from inside, laughter fading into hushed conversation. It sounded like people were settling into their places. Mason looked around for Theo's warning to turn into something real, but the room was mostly what he expected. A few beds lined up, blankets folded neatly, table with thermoses, an old window fogged at the edges. He found the last open spot on one of the beds. He sat down, set his duffel on the floor, and exhaled. Then the heater clicked and coughed. The room filled with a thin puff of cold air. Mason pulled the blanket closer. He waited for the heater to catch up. It didn't. A few minutes later, he heard movement outside the cabin door. Footsteps and a low voice. A knock. "Mason?" Theo called softly. Mason's stomach tightened. He hadn't told Theo his room assignment. How did he know? Or maybe he just assumed. Mason stood, opened the door a crack. Cold air spilled in. "Yeah." Theo stood in the porch light with his beanie pulled down. "The heater's busted." Caleb said, "The line's freezing." "He's going to check it." Mason blinked. "He said that?" Theo nodded. He didn't want anyone to get sick. Mason's thoughts snagged on the way. Caleb seemed to be thinking ahead about him. As if Mason's comfort mattered, even though Mason hadn't asked for anything. Mason's voice came out careful. "I'm fine." Theo's expression softened. "Sure, but you look like you're going to disappear inside that blanket." "I'm just checking." Before Mason could respond, Theo stepped back and called over his shoulder, "Caleb, he's here." Footsteps approached from the side of the cabin. Caleb appeared, holding a small toolbox, the metal glinting faintly. He looked winded from the cold, cheeks slightly red. He paused when he saw Mason. "There you are," Caleb said. Mason forced his shoulders down. "I'm right here." Caleb nodded. Like he understood the subtext, Mason didn't want to admit. "Give me a minute." He stepped into the hallway, crouched by the heater unit. He didn't touch Mason immediately. He didn't crowd. He moved with a kind of respect that made Mason feel strange gratitude and even stranger fear. "What's wrong?" Mason asked. Caleb glanced at him. "The line is freezing. It's probably fine if we restart it, but I can't do it from your side. It needs the breaker and a little heat to get back up." Mason held his breath. "I don't know anything about that." Caleb's mouth twitched. "Then you don't need to. Just stay warm." Mason almost laughed at the simplicity of it. Stay warm. As if it were that easy. The heater clicked again, but the cold didn't loosen. Caleb worked by feel, adjusting a valve, tapping the side of the unit. The sound was sharp in the quiet cabin. Mason stood near the wall, arms crossed, trying not to let his body shiver. Theo leaned in the doorway, watching like he could sense the emotional temperature rising. After a few minutes, Caleb turned his head. "Do you have an extra layer?" he asked. Mason hesitated, then answered honestly. "I brought one sweatshirt. It's on the bed." Caleb stood slowly. Bite. Looked at Mason in a way that made Mason feel like he was being evaluated for something tender, not dangerous. Caleb stepped into the room and crouched by Mason's duffel. Mason tensed. He didn't want strangers digging into his things. But Caleb only moved carefully, pulling the sweatshirt out and holding it out. "Here?" Mason stared at the fabric as if it were a question. He didn't move at first. Theo cleared his throat softly. "Take it, Mason." "You're freezing." Mason's voice came out rough. "I said I'm fine." Caleb's eyes didn't harden. "You're not fine. You're just used to pretending." Mason felt his throat burn. Nobody had said that so plainly in months. He took the sweatshirt, fingers brushing Caleb's for a moment. The contact was brief, but it made Mason's body react, like it had been waiting for permission to feel. "Thanks," he whispered. Caleb stood and adjusted the heater again. The unit finally warmed with a slow, reluctant hum. Heat pushed into the room like an animal slowly waking. Mason exhaled. He didn't realize how much his chest had been tight until it loosened. Caleb leaned his hands on his knees. Sweat glistened on his forehead despite the cold. He looked exhausted, but his focus stayed on the heater till the warmth stabilized. Then Caleb straightened. It should hold now. Theo clapped his hands once. See? Team effort. Mason tried to laugh with them, but it felt thin. Why do you keep checking on me? Caleb's expression shifted. Not defensive, honest. Because I noticed you, Mason's pulse stuttered. Theo gave them space, stepping toward the table to pour something into a cup. Caleb's voice softened. You don't have to answer me. I'm not asking you to explain your whole life. I just... He paused, searching for the safest way to say it. When someone's hurting, they tend to try to hide it. And I hate watching that. I can't stand it. Mason felt something in him crack, not break all the way, but open a seam. He stared down at his sweatshirt sleeves, then looked back up. You don't even know me. Caleb nodded. No. But I know what it looks like when a person is bracing for rejection, Mason swallowed. Maybe I'm just tired. Caleb's eyes held steady. If you're tired, then let me sit with you while you rest. That's all. The words sounded simple, but Mason heard the tenderness behind them. It wasn't a demand, it was a doorway. Mason glanced at Theo, who pretended to examine the thermos lid like the conversation could be kept at a distance. Mason looked back at Caleb. And if I don't want company. Caleb's mouth pressed into a line, but his face remained kind. Then I'll go back outside and pretend I didn't ask. Mason almost hated how much respect Caleb put into it. Respect like Caleb would accept a no without punishing Mason for it. Mason's voice softened. You're not going to? He stopped, not sure how to finish the thought. Caleb finished for him quietly. I'm not going to take anything from you. I'm just going to be here. Mason felt tears rise, sudden and humiliating. He blinked hard, angry at his body for reacting. I don't want to be seen like this, Mason admitted. Caleb didn't say, then don't. He didn't try to fix it. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed opposite Mason, close enough that Mason could feel warmth from him, far enough that Mason could choose the distance. Okay, Caleb said. Then I'll just be here. You can pretend I'm part of the room. Mason let out a breath that shook. You make it hard to pretend. Caleb's gaze softened. Maybe that's the point. Mason looked away. He stared at the window, where fog pressed against the glass. Beyond it, dark rows of vines disappeared into night. He thought about his ex. He thought about the way he used to believe that love meant staying. Then he remembered the last text that never got answered, how Mason had stared at the screen until his eyes hurt. He said, I don't even know if I'm allowed to want things anymore. Caleb's voice was careful. Allowed? Mason nodded barely. After what happened, I feel like I broke the rules of being loved. Like I should know better than to reach. Caleb's hand rested on his knee. He didn't move toward Mason. He just spoke, like every word was a promise he wanted to keep. You didn't do anything wrong, Caleb said. You trusted. That's not a crime. People leave for reasons that don't always have anything to do with how lovable you are. Mason's chest tightened. You say that like you know. Caleb's eyes flickered, as if he was choosing truth over performance. I know because I've done the leaving. Not the way you're imagining. I didn't ghost someone like some coward. But I did walk away when I should have stayed. I told myself it was for the other person. I told myself it would be easier. And then, I watched how it hollowed them out. Mason stared at him. Caleb continued quietly. I spent a long time thinking I was saving someone. I wasn't. I was saving myself from being honest about my own fear. And when I finally realized it, I couldn't fix what I broke. I could only learn to be different next time, Mason's voice cracked. Did they ever forgive you? Caleb shook his head. I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. I know I didn't deserve forgiveness, but I still— His jaw tightened. I still wanted to stop hurting people. Silence filled the cabin. The heater hummed. Somewhere outside, the wind moved through the vines. Theo returned to the doorway with 2 cups and offered one to Mason. Mason accepted it automatically, because it was something to hold. Theo looked between them. I'm going to sleep, he announced. You two keep not murdering each other. Mason let out a small laugh through his nerves. Theo smirked and slipped out, leaving the cabin with an almost gentle finality. Now it was only Mason and Caleb. Mason held his cup and stared at the steam. How do you not? He began, then stopped. Caleb waited. Mason tried again. How do you not make this into something it isn't? Caleb's eyes softened. Because you're not a problem to solve. You're a person to meet. Mason swallowed hard. He looked down at his hands. I'm scared. Caleb nodded once. I'm also scared. Mason looked up quickly. You? Caleb smiled, small and honest. Yeah, because I like being with you, and if I say that too loudly, you'll run. Or you'll shut down, or you'll pretend you didn't hear. Mason's breath caught. I wouldn't run. Caleb's eyes searched his face. Would you stay? Mason didn't answer right away. He felt the old instincts rise, the urge to protect himself with distance, to turn any tenderness into a joke, to retreat before someone could retreat first. He thought about his ex again, about the way he'd begged for clarity, about the way he'd tried to earn love by being easy. He remembered promising himself he wouldn't do that again. But this wasn't begging. Caleb wasn't demanding. Caleb was offering presents. Mason's voice was barely audible. Stay in the room, he said. Caleb's shoulders loosened, relief moving through him like warm air. I can do that? Mason shifted on the bed. He kept his body turned slightly away, like he needed to maintain control of the distance. Caleb stayed where he was, letting Mason decide. Minutes passed. Mason drank a little of the warm liquid. Caleb didn't talk much, but every so often he'd say something small, not to fill the silence but to keep it human. He asked about Mason's day. He asked what Mason did before the Vineyard. Mason gave answers carefully, as if each sentence cost him. But with each answer, Caleb made space for Mason's hesitations, instead of rushing them. At some point, Mason realized Caleb's breathing had matched his. The cabin felt less like a trap and more like shelter. In the quiet, Mason admitted, when my ex left, I kept thinking I'd done something to deserve it. Like, love is a test, and I failed. Caleb nodded. Tests are cruel. Mason gave a shaky laugh. I know, but my brain kept acting like it was normal. Caleb's voice was soft. You were loyal. You were trying to understand. That's not failing. That's being human. Mason stared at the wall. It hurts anyway. Caleb leaned forward slightly, still not touching. I know it hurts. And I'm not going to tell you. Time fixes it like magic. Mason looked at him. Then what? Caleb's eyes held steady, as if the answer mattered more than being convincing. Time helps only when you let it. And when you stop punishing yourself for being able to love in the first place. Mason's throat tightened again. He didn't cry fully. He just felt the tears sit behind his eyes, heavy but present. Caleb reached for his own mug and took a sip. Then slowly turned his body a little toward Mason, giving him more access, not physical, just emotional. I can't erase your past, Caleb said, but I can be honest about now. Mason's heart thumped. What does that mean? Caleb swallowed. It means I don't want you to feel alone here. Not tonight. Mason's hands tightened around the mug. And if I don't want to talk about it? Caleb nodded. Then we won't. We can just sit. Mason looked at the space between them. The distance felt suddenly fragile, like it could shatter if either of them moved too fast. He let himself scoot a little closer on the bed. Caleb noticed immediately. His body didn't lunge. It simply softened, like he'd been bracing for impact and was relieved it didn't come. Mason said quietly, "You can hold my hand." The words surprised even him. They came out before he could retreat behind caution. Caleb's eyes widened slightly. Then he exhaled like he'd been holding his breath all night. He reached toward Mason slowly, palm open. Mason lifted his hand first. Their fingers met warm, careful, deliberate. Mason felt the click of fear trying to reassemble itself. But Caleb's grip didn't tighten like possession. It was steady like reassurance. Mason closed his eyes briefly. In the dark, he imagined his ex's face, the memory sharp as glass. He wanted to hate it. He wanted to hate the ache for existing. Instead, he realized the ache was proof that Mason had been alive when he loved. He whispered, "I didn't think anyone would care like this." Caleb's thumb moved in a slow circle on Mason's knuckles, gentle enough to feel like permission. "Caring isn't rare," Caleb said. "It's just quiet. People like you end up thinking you're the only one." Mason opened his eyes. "Am I?" Caleb shook his head. "No, you're just tired. Dear. And you keep surviving on instinct." Mason's voice turned small. "It's all I have." Caleb leaned closer, forehead angled toward Mason's shoulder, but not pressing. "You also have choices. You can keep surviving, or you can start living again one day at a time, even if it's messy." Mason stared at Caleb's face. The cabin light caught his eyes, turning them darker and more honest. Mason whispered, "How can I start when I'm afraid the next person will hurt me?" Caleb's answer came after a beat, like he respected the weight of the question. "Because you don't get to choose whether people hurt you. You choose what you do with yourself when it happens. Choose whether you punish your own heart for their decisions." Mason swallowed. "And you?" Caleb's mouth tightened slightly, a confession trying to form. "I'm learning to ask for what I want without turning it into a threat." Mason's thumb pressed lightly against Caleb's hand. "What do you want?" Caleb's gaze held Mason's. "To be the kind of person you—" Tan. The words hit Mason like warmth and like fear at once. He didn't pull away. Instead he asked, "Say it again, but slower." Caleb smiled, softer. "I want to be the kind of person you can trust." Mason let his eyes close again. He felt the quiet relief of being heard, of being offered something real, without strings. Outside, the vineyard wind eased into stillness. Mason thought about how unlikely this was. Two men in a vineyard cabin during harvest, in the middle of work that should have been only practical. And yet, here he was, holding Caleb's hand like it was a lifeline, not a fantasy. A real thing, a real moment. He opened his eyes. "If we do this," he said carefully, "I need you to understand something." Caleb's thumb paused. "Okay," Mason's voice steadied, becoming more honest than brave. "I don't want to rush. I don't want to pretend I'm healed. And if I get scared, I might go quiet. That doesn't mean I don't care. It means I'm trying." Caleb nodded slowly. "Then I'll be patient. And when you go quiet, I'll stay quiet with you." "I won't treat it like rejection." Mason's throat tightened. "Promise." Caleb didn't hesitate. "Promise." Mason felt the words settle into him. Promise, not hope, not maybe. not something that would vanish when the night ended. He leaned his head back against the headboard and exhaled, his shoulders dropping like he'd been holding himself upright all day just to keep from falling. He didn't realize he'd shifted until Caleb's hand moved slightly closer, fingers threading through his with a gentleness that felt like a vow rather than a claim. The clock on the wall clicked toward later hour. Mason listened to Caleb breathe. Somewhere in the back of his mind, his grief still existed. It would exist tomorrow, too. But for this moment, it didn't swallow him. For this moment, he let himself believe that love could be slow and real and still safe. As the heater hummed and their hands stayed linked, Mason felt the guarded walls around his heart not disappear, but loosen, like a knot being untied. And when his eyelids finally grew heavy, Caleb's voice drifted in the quiet, low, and warm. "Good night," Caleb said. Mason didn't answer right away. He was afraid that if he spoke, the night would end. Then he whispered, "Stay here." "Until I fall asleep?" Caleb squeezed his hand once, careful and tender. "I will." Mason closed his eyes, letting the vineyard night wrap around him. Lantern glow, heat in the cabin, the steady rhythm of someone choosing him without taking anything from him. And the next morning, when the light finally came, Mason would have to face the truth he'd been avoiding all along, that he didn't just want to survive harvest season anymore. He wanted to see what could grow after it. End with a hopeful, tender note.